Καλησπέρα και καλώς ορίσατε. Good evening and welcome to the second History Culture Seminar for 2023, brought to you by the Greek community of Melbourne and Victoria. My name is Spyridula Dimitriou, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land upon which we work, live and learn. We pay our respects to the Kulin Nation, their elders past, present and emerging, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I would like to welcome Dr. Anna Fyta, who is our presenter tonight all the way from Athens, who will discuss the life and work of the important Greek author Galatea Alexiou Kazantzaki. The topic of tonight's talk is entitled Galatea Alexiou Kazantzaki, 1884 to 1962, a modernist Greek woman in the shadow of a great man. I would like to frame Dr. Fyta's lecture in the context of International Women's Day, which was celebrated globally yesterday and commemorates the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women. Dr. Fyta's lecture aims to shed new light on this significant female author whose artistic value and impact are still waiting for fuller recognition and acknowledgement from the wider literary community. Dr. Fyta currently teaches English and American literature at the Psychikos Athens College in Greece. Her doctoral and comparative literary research focus on modernist poetry and the reception of Greek classics. Dr. Fyta's doctoral thesis explores the dialogue of the American modernist poet Hilda Doolittle with the ancient Greek tragedian Euripides. Sections of her research and academic work involve the interdisciplinary conversations of American women poets with classical Hellenism and Greek mythology. Dr. Fyta's essay on HD, as Hilda Doolittle is known, titled Translation as Mythopoesis, Helen in Egypt and Meta Palinode, was published in the volume The Classics in Modernist Translation by Bloomsbury Academic Publishing. Her article titled Dramatic Heterotopias and Transformations in Mythic Space, which appeared in the journal Eccentric Narratives, Journal of Anglophone Literature, Culture and Media, was published by the Aristotle University in 2020. Here, Dr. Fyta interprets Joan Jonas's post-conceptual project, Lines in the Sand, alongside HD's epic poem, Helen in Egypt. Her essay entitled Galatea Alexiou Kazantzaki, 1884 to 1962, a modernist Greek author's decadent poetics, appeared in the journal titled Feminist Modern Studies in 2020. The subject of tonight's talk, the author Galatea Alexiou Kazantzaki, was born in Heraklion Crete in 1884. She was the daughter of the publisher and author Stylianos Alexiou and sister to the author and novelist and academic Ellie Alexiou. Galatea Alexiou Kazantzaki was one of the most prolific female authorial voices in Greek modernism, and yet to this date she remains one of the most understudied Greek writers in Anglophone literature. Her surname, associated with her first husband Nikos Kazantzakis, seems to have had a negative impact on her recognition as a major female author of the 20th century Greek arts and letters. Dr. Fyta will visit Galatea Kazantzakis' early years when the author was making her way in a largely male-dominated literary canon. Her emergence and consistent contribution to Greek literature, journalism, and political activism was not only heavily debated, but it was also often derided as subsidiary to or lacking the rigour of her male counterparts. This lecture will examine Kazantzakis' multifaceted approaches to poetry, translation, essay, novel, and drama. First conceived during the period of Greek aestheticism and modernism, Kazantzakis' works span through the decades of the interwar years, the German occupation, and post-World War II Greece until her untimely death in 1962. I would like to thank the sponsor of tonight's lecture, Roma Sciauro, and without further ado, I hand you over to Dr. Fyta. Enjoy.
Hello. I hope you can hear me well. Good evening, Melbourne from Athens. It's early morning here, just 10 a.m. on March 9th, 2023, on a sunny day that looks like spring, and barely 24 hours after International Women's Day. But today we will extend this special time a little longer. I feel honored to be with you here, sadly online, to talk to you about Galatea Alexiou, a woman of whose work and importance for the Greek arts and letters I was completely unaware until a few years ago on a chance visit to a theater performance in Athens to watch Gynekes, Women, an episodic novella that was staged for the Greek theater in 2018. Galatea's name was familiar. The echoes of her failed marriage to Nikos Kazantzakis still resonant after just 97 years since their divorce. Also, some fragments of information had sporadically reached me in the course of my studies, but the length and depth of her contribution and her importance for the emerging and evolving Greek modernisms had completely escaped my attention. And then I started digging, and it did not take me that long to realize a continuous, vibrant presence fighting for the advancement of Greek modernism and the education of Greeks and Greek women in general. But first, let's see her dynamic entrance into the world of arts and letters. Galatea Alexiou wrote in February 1909 for the Greek journal Numas, which at the time was published in Alexandria of Egypt. The name of Mr. Cavafy, I read, was new to me. In the hours of the twilight, it was only natural that his lovely, softly pronounced words would move me. There were two aspects that I found outstanding in his poetry: his deeply philosophical, knowing gaze into human nature and his poetic sensibility. A young author like Galatea, who almost prophetically heralds the advent of an internationally recognized in our time Greek poet, cannot but be viewed as discerning, if not charismatic, in her ability to intuit talent and uniqueness. Galatea clearly outlines his writing style: the Alexandrian poet's melancholia, his emotional fragility, and his apartness from a world that seems unable to accept or even reach out towards those who think differently. But how could a 25-year-old woman be capable of understanding the potential of an emerging yet consummate poet like Constantine Cavafy? Did she have the right for such interpolations and assessments into the male literary turf? Most likely not. To better understand the world in which Galatea and other women artists and authors of the time period were born into and tried to make their own mark in literary history, we must fleetingly become exposed to the perspectives of the dominant, largely patriarchal literary elite. In 1896, Emmanuel Louroidis, eminent author, critic, and scholiast, using his distinctive, slightly acerbic authorial tinge, dismissed the so-called writing Greek women because in their work, they attempted to emulate the male writing and language, disavowing in this way the distinctive, or if you like it, feminine, uh, yet required for their gendered traits, such as gracefulness, finesse, love for beauty, sensitivity, and or cunning. A quick look at Galatea's lifeline shows at first that she was born into the small community of Heraklion in Crete. Now, we're looking at a screenshot of a documentary from the archives of the national Greek television. Here, the camera captures the entrance to the house that hosted Galatea's family, a mansion almost. It was divided into two parts. It was a massive structure, and the first part of the house hosted Galatea's family, and the second, adjoining part, the mayor of Heraklion, who was appointed by the Turkish government at the time, and with whom Alexiou family was on friendly terms. In this house, Galatea was born in 1884, and this is where she grew up as a daughter of a highly esteemed family. Her father, Stylianos Alexiou, was a respected publisher, printer, and a man of letters. She grew up with her siblings, two brothers, and her sister Ellie. The family home hosted an extensive library collection. This allowed young Galatea to educate herself since she was a young child. She became proficient in Greek and French, especially when she continued her education at the French Catholic school in Heraklion. Galatea's education included a thorough knowledge of ancient Greek and Latin, and later on English, as well as German and Russian. Galatea's language aptitude and her poetic ear allowed her to work with creative translation throughout her prolific career as a professional author. According to Galatea, to become an author, one must always be highly educated. Otherwise, they will resort to banality and tediousness. Galatea's assertion on the role of education serves as a confirmation that her family, despite its strict for the time standards, never stood in the way of their children's career choices. A very great matter, I believe. The next slide shows us an improvised timeline. This timeline shows some of the most important highlights in Galatea's life as she lives long enough to experience two world wars, the destruction and loss of the Hellenic civilization in Asia Minor, one dictatorship, two world wars, and the post-World War II civil strife that divided the Greek nation. Beginning from 1906, time marker of her first publications, I have divided her written production according to decade and by genre, though we will focus a bit more closely on her most important works and perhaps come to understand, even if in part, the significance and, above all, the indomitable spirit of one of the female high Greek modernist authors of the previous century. The first period of Galatea's engagement with literature and the arts was decadent, the first years, her engagement with decadent aestheticism. At this particular time, Galatea has already started working as an author because she knew that her calling, her vocation, was to become a writer. To this end, she knew that education was a pivotal factor. Her passage through the period of Greek decadence was short-lived, yet crucial for her evolution as a writer. Using a variety of pen names, including her family name, Alexiou, Galatea signs as Lalo de Castro, Panoria, Galatea S. Alexiou, and Petrula Psiloriti. Following the poetic trends of the time, Galatea experiments with the prose poem. Her version of Salome is a response to Oscar Wilde's famous decadent play of the same title. But Galatea, signing as Lalo de Castro, provides another dimension for this notorious femme fatale. Salome is rebellious, and in this allegorical prose poem, she tries to evade pain. The female persona in Salome predates and complements the publication of Galatea's first decadent novella, Ridi Pagliazzo, Laugh Clown, a work that, like most of Galatea's writings, stirred a lot of controversy among the Greek audiences because of its depiction of a woman that reverses the stereotypes of femininity. Numas publishes this first novella in 3 installments. The publication of Ridi Pagliazzo coincides time-wise with the historic pronouncement of Eleftherios Venizelos as the nation's great benefactor, Megas Evergetis. At the same time, Nikos Kazantzakis writes a laudatory review in which he characterizes Galatea and her work as a blood-red mutinous discord. Ridi and its author receive many flattering reviews from Athens, Paris, and Liverpool, but Galatea never boasted nor took much pride in her accomplishments. Kazantzakis' review became one of the main reasons the pair met for the first time. Her meeting with Kazantzakis soon flourished into a passionate love affair, along with a social scandal that found both families, especially Kazantzakis' father, indignant at their children's choices. And though Kazantzakis attempted at first to make a more pronounced commitment to the affair, he also contended, and I quote, "creative freedom means freedom from the bonds of social conventions." You see, Kazantzakis, at least at the time, supported that marriage is a fake social construct that chains an individual's inner freedoms and eventually deprives him of his creativity. Nevertheless, the couple decided at some point to get secretly married against their family's desires. Soon after that, they moved to Athens. But this departure from Crete also signaled the ending of their idyll. Many sources agree that the pair was staggeringly incompatible. She, passionate, extroverted, explosive, erotic. He, an introvert, emotionally and erotically restrained. George Raptopoulos, a current modern Greek writer, recently published a fictional account of the affair between Nikos Kazantzakis and Galatea, using the charged, rather sensationalistic title Untouched, or if I were to translate it more literally, it would be Unsullied. The narrative is based on a not so unsound allegation that the marriage between the two was never consummated. Kazantzakis was a chimera seeker, an individual hunting for the unseemly and the ideal, a real-life foil to his literary character Zorba, in other words. Kazantzakis begins his long journeys in Europe, and while he writes to her copious letters in which he expresses his desire to reunite with his wife, he hopes this will be done on his own terms. That is, if Galatea chooses to leave from Athens and join him on his quests. Kazantzakis' travels take him to several countries. He has written a lot about that. And his journey began as early as 1907 and ended prior to his death in 1957. As correspondent, he collaborates and sends travel and other pieces to Ελεύθερος Τύπος, Αναγέννηση, Καθημερινή, Ακρόπολη, Νεοελληνικά Γράμματα, the most mainstream, one could assert, newspapers of the time period. From Germany, he will write to Galatea about the emerging working class in the face of the anonymous hungry worker. Kazantzakis sees, and I quote, "the face of my new God, as I have already written to you, Cherie, a hungry worker who toils endlessly and then rebels, a worker who smells of tobacco and wine, dark, strong, filled to the brim with desires and thirst for vengeance." His choice to be as far away and for as long as possible, here's a funny picture I thought I would include in my presentation, this departure signposts the end of the marriage and Galatea's request to be divorced on amicable terms soon comes. Her decision to keep his surname was pivotal for her career and its twists and turns, as we will see. And here is an area for which we know very little about. After 1915, Galatea's writing begins to lean towards realism and naturalism, away from decadent aestheticism. But her attention was also drawn by social concerns that tormented post-World War I Greece. Her engagement with the political life in Greece, as well as her activism, becomes more systematic and more pronounced. Like most of her modernist contemporaries, Galatea was a proponent of education, which she saw as the only means of truly liberating the mind of any oppressed individual. School books were too obsolete and poorly written, according to Galatea, and they did not in the least help young students develop their intellect, imagination, and free choice. The primary move was to do away with the old katharevousa and its ornate artificial class-dividing, discriminatory nature. A small note here for the audience. At the time, the educated people spoke and wrote using katharevousa because by doing so, they signposted their class, a kind of class distinction from the common people who used demotiki, because the people who were using demotiki revealed their socioeconomic deficiency. Galatea's contribution to the advancement of Greek demotiki in schools is considered of paramount importance. At that time, Galatea wrote a number of books exclusively for children, quality books. She composed a series of books for school, the famous Anagnostica for primary school years. And she translated folk tales, and she wrote fairy tales and plays for the theater for children exclusively. The bulk, however, of her work during the interwar years is dedicated to politics and feminism. Galatea is working at a time when women have very little public presence. We are told that it was just 1944 and when for the first time in history women voted for the election of the National Council. So Galatea, in fact, had a long way to travel. So at the epicenter of global summons for revision and at a time that invited change and reformation, Kazantzaki was the most important spokesperson of emerging Greek women intellectuals. This small extract comes from Ellie Alexiou, Galatea's sister, which somehow reflects that Galatea is known in Greece for her engagement as a journalist, an essayist, and political commentator. Even in the earlier years of her career, when her first articles were published in Pinakotheki, her writings would cause a stir among the readers. Her 1907 piece, Eulogy, an authorial prose narrative, caused an uproar among the Cretan readers, some of whom, according to the Greek National Television Archive, publicly tore up the pieces of the journal. The reason for this aggression: Eulogy, among other early writings that Galatea submitted at Pinakotheki, is a piece of scathing social critique against the community's hypocrisy and brutality that drove a young woman to suicide for religious reasons. Galatea's polemic writing for a redefinition of women's role in the early 20th century Greece extended beyond the Cretan press. Her 1910 review of Irene Dimitrakopoulou's controversial play To Xerizoma, Uprooting, for the magazine Panathenaea, for instance, took the form of a mini-feminist manifesto. The play was dealing with the concept of a dysfunctional marriage. Trapped in this unhappy marriage, the female protagonist in Dimitrakopoulou's play rebels against societal rules and abandons husband and family. Kazantzaki admonishes emerging women authors to be honest, sharp-witted, and unrelenting in their critique of social ills. Her involvement in socialism and left-wing politics gives her the incentive to shed light to other authors' works that criticize and question issues like race, plutocracy, oppression, and exploitation of the working classes and women. Galatea, in the socialist pro-demotic group of authors who founded the journal Renaissance, Anagennisi, writes articles on the emancipation of women and the feminist movement. Following the general understanding that there is a kind of art that may be defined as prolet cult, proletariat culture, a term coined by the communist newspaper Rizospastis, Galatea publishes and translates Jack London's 1908 novel The Iron Heel. Among her translations, the magazine Nei Protopori publishes Langston Hughes' recently published prose poem Advertisement for the Waldorf Astoria. That was in 1931. Apart from her writing, Galatea undertakes the task of editorial work, and in 1931 becomes the chief editor of Protopori. In 1933, she moves from Protopori to its new offshoot, Nei Protopori. Both journals refer to themselves as monthly reviews for advanced intellectual pursuits. This seemingly arrogant elitism was not groundless. The editorial team consisted of highly regarded intellectuals in Greece, Varnelis, Pikros, Voutiras, Anthias, and Galatea Kazantzaki. All were united under one goal: to promote the image of the working class hero, the struggling proletarian, an ideologue whose aims supported the promotion of justice and social inequality. A brief list highlighting Galatea's seminal non-literary contributions to the socio-political causes that impacted Greece involve, and here I will have to backtrack. Yes, the petition complaining against the slander written around about Constantine Cavafy in Alexandria, writing in 1928, The Working Woman in Contemporary Society. In 1932, Galatea signs the anti-war manifesto. In 1935, at Spinaloga, with the lepers. In 1936, in line with Harmony, here she produces a number of articles and essays that address the role of women in society, as well as other burning social issues. 1936, the half-humorous Is a Pretty Woman Smart? More in 1936, where the modern Greek woman works today. Here, and I would like to pause a little bit, it is a series of articles, investigative articles, where Galatea wrote her discoveries after visiting various factories and recorded the working conditions of women there. More, 1936, The Intellectual Women of Athens, in which Galatea signs a petition addressed to the President of the Greek government and the Minister of Interior to grant amnesty to political prisoners. 1945, the Popular Theatre. Here, Galatea submits a research study on the theatre. 1952, Two Worlds, and 1957, The People of Arts and Letters, who condemn the persecution of the human spirit. This particular publication consists of opinion pieces by Greek intellectuals against censorship in theatre and publishing. Galatea is one of the authors. In my presentation, I have also included a small mosaic of Galatea's literary production. It is impossible to mention all of them, but I suppose that by now you have all begun realizing that Galatea somehow was a person who went beyond her limits and beyond the restrictions of the time period. Her literary production includes her translations. Here are some of them we have already mentioned: The Iron Heel, Jack London, and Langston Hughes. But Galatea has also produced a series of different translations from different areas and from different disciplines. If only we could look at 1907, beginning from lyric poems to psychology and psychopathology, Theodule Ribot's Maladies of Memory and Maladies of Personality, a very current and very crucial body of works by the French author who began writing systematically on psychology. In 1925, Galatea translates Prometheus Bound. The play was staged and performed with the role of the protagonist given to Marika Kotopouli, who held the female role and who is considered one of the historic presences in the Greek theater, or a German fairy tale, or a French socialist philosopher, or the Russian Chekhov, The Three Sisters, which was also staged with Kotopouli in the National Theatre. Galatea also looks at Chekhov's On the High Road, or let's look at this coincidence, which is not a coincidence, Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan. She translates Leo Tolstoy, his autobiographical piece, My Life, which was published after Galatea's death. And of course, the posthumous publication of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, posthumous as in after Galatea's passing. Once again, in her fiction work, Galatea turns to the exposure of social evils. Her fiction work, her own original fiction work, looks at those who are suffering and those who are underprivileged or marginalized. Galatea knew too well the difference in a narrow-minded society with petty motives and no understanding or compassion inevitably drive an individual to despair or unreasonable bias. The following list also that we're looking at right now contains a selection of some of the most important works, well, subjectively chosen, in fiction and fictionalized true stories like the narrative in Sick City. Sick City refers, a romance, a rather ironic title, refers to Spinaloga, following Galatea's research into the leper island, as it was known back in the time. Galatea writes a story of a doomed romance where she reveals the social hypocrisy and intolerance. In 1929, I chose 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., a series of short stories for which she was heavily criticized, especially by Photos Politis, to whom later on Galatea responded. And I think that her response, which was not an apology, but it was more like a writer's declaration and defense of her work, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., the story involves women as they are facing daily challenges. 1933, Women, a series of episodic portraits, I would call them, of women. 1935, Men, so now we have a balance. In 1950, Before Sunset and Other Stories. In 1952, Critical Moments. In 1957, Humans and Superhumans. In 1960, we don't have a date here, 32 poems and short stories. In 1963, A World Arriving and The World Departing, a series of short stories published and uncollected, which were also posthumously published. The core of these stories that I have listed here reflects Galatea's resentment of the society and its inability to mind more sensitive social groups that are prone to prostitution, crime, and a destitute life with no escape, exactly because they have no protection or no support. The moral dilemmas and the emotional ordeals of the 20th century woman are exposed with disarming honesty and deep compassion, as is the case of the young woman in the short narrative 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Galatea's young protagonist must quickly decide whether she will give in to her boss's sexual advances or whether she will find herself falling through the cracks of society once she's out of work, in the streets, unemployed and poor. The Greeks know Galatea for her theatre, mostly. And though her Galatea's plays are not frequently staged, on occasion we will see a version which appears or springs up in a theater somewhere in Athens. Galatea's concerns in her dramatic output are the so-called social wounds: patriarchal autocracy, exploitation of human resources, the working man or the working woman, and country people. If we add the number of plays, one act and full plays, I think that we will get up to, or probably more than, this staggering number of written production of over 60 plays. So in my list, I have included some published and staged plays and some uncollected, unpublished plays, which nevertheless were at some point in her life and afterwards staged. The final part of my discussion, and I will not tire you with more lists of Galatea's accomplishments, involve Galatea's work in studies and essays. 1925, Galatea writes a theoretical piece in which she discusses theatre. In 1925, she also writes notes on aesthetics and the role of the upcoming groups of new poets and writers. In 1954, she writes the introduction to a translated triptych in Irving Shaw, Vercors, and Stefan Zweig. In 1954, she writes an essay which then becomes a lecture on Maxim Gorky. And in 1964, a posthumous volume titled Galatea Kazantzaki in Memoriam, which contains collected and uncollected works by her and about her, is published to honor her presence. A field that I have not touched upon at all, because I think that Galatea's poetry needs to be experienced, is the output of her poetic oeuvre. A variety of poetic forms. Galatea experimented with all forms of poetry, including the sonnet and the lyric poem. From her poetry, we have some samples of the prose poem in her early period, but she added translations of modern and more classic literary works. Galatea kept writing poetry throughout her career, though her poems were sporadically published in periodicals and the journals of the time. In Greece, however, Galatea was never acknowledged as a poet because she has been known for her active career as dramatist. Some of her plays have been given awards and accolades, but most of them have received heavy blows, heavy criticism from both political sides. So perhaps we could open the discussion to a very important question that has been bothering critics and those who would like to look at Galatea Kazantzaki and should look at Galatea Kazantzaki favorably, in a more favorable, in a more fair light. A sound example of the controversy that Galatea could stir in the Greek literary circles was the publication of Humans and Superhumans. That was a highly debated and semi-autobiographical 1957 novel, a kind of Bildungsroman, but also Galatea's critique of her former husband, Nikos Kazantzakis. Now, the publication of Humans and Superhumans met the critics' hostility, or perhaps revived the critics' harshness, perhaps because their negative opinion of Galatea had never really subsided. Accused of one-sidedness, of criticizing and writing harshly and unfairly about a great man of letters, Galatea was once again deprived of the right to air her views, and perhaps a last attempt at exercising and dispelling the shadow of a great man of Greek letters. Marcus Avieris, a poet, writer, and Galatea's second husband from 1926 until her death, 1962, comes to her defense, and I believe that Avieris's words in part explain why and who buried Galatea. In his article, published in 1977, 15 years after Galatea's death, Avieris writes, Galatea, and I quote him, Galatea offers genuine pieces of life she effortlessly extracts from her inner gold mines. Her realism was a sui generis articulation of ideas, an art without trickery, as she used to say, in direct contact with the tradition of realism forged by the first classic works written by Greek novelists. Humans and Superhumans is a novel for which both left and right-wing critics were undecided. The right claimed that it was not a novel, and the left took no clear sides. Our criticism often finds itself in conflict when certain genres and certain voices manage to produce genuine realism and do not evade the predicaments of the daily life of the common person. These issues become indecipherable, confusing, and nobody takes the trouble to define the modern novel. And this is my final, perhaps, note for Kazantzaki, for Galatea today, that in my recent essay, I provide a very quick summary of her importance, that her presence in Greek literary and social political life may best be summarized as follows. Galatea left a strong mark on the cultural, literary, political, and artistic life of the 20th century Greece, with her writings as a woman, poet, novelist, dramatist, essayist, journalist, editor, political activist, and translator. In fact, Galatea molded her personal authorial signature and a concomitant presence in the history of a country still in the process of recovery from its fractured history. And though Galatea was buried under the male competitiveness and inflexible canon of a male high modernist coterie, the general indecision of modernisms, and all the isms globally during a period of over 50 years of flux and instability could be seen as an additional reason for Galatea's burial. A world under duress, one great war and crisis after another, a growing tidal wave of conservatism in reaction to the aftermath of World War II, the civil war in Greece, Cold War, and more than that, hostility against any liberal or left-wing tendencies, beginning from the 1930s and continuing well into the next 4 decades, inevitably forced many intellectuals and poets with socialist convictions or agendas to the margins. Galatea was one of them. So was Melpo Axioti, who lived the largest part of her life in exile, and so was Galatea's sister, Ellie Alexiou, and so was Didos Sotiriou. Until 2012, there was no systematic reference material to the works of Galatea Kazantzaki Alexiou, nor a consistent archive that would host her extant manuscripts. But in 2008, a team of graduate students at the University of Heraklion in Crete, and under the tutelage of Professor Angela Kastrinaki, was already busy compiling what came out 4 years later in 2012, an 80-page publication catalogue of works by and about Galatea Kazantzaki. For my talk today, and bearing in mind that we are celebrating International Women's Day, I am here with you from Athens to offer my readings of an important Greek modernist woman whose choice to maintain her first husband's name as her signature perhaps determined her future career and authorial role to live in the shadow of a great man. Apart from my great thanks to the Greek community in Melbourne and Mr. Nikos Dallas for the hospitality, I would like to dedicate my talk on Galatea today to Susan Stanford Friedman, Professor Emerita in the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin, who passed recently. Susan's pioneering work into modernist feminisms brought to light some of the silenced, buried women like Hilda Doolittle, and encouraged us scholars to pursue more deserving women from our own cultures, like Galatea Kazantzaki. And what is more rewarding than bringing these women to light so that we may celebrate them, ideally, every year, and one new woman author every year. How wonderful would that be? And because I spoke very little, if at all, about Galatea's poetry, I would like to finish with one of her poems, which was turned into a song, and I would like to end my presentation with a song. In 2004, eminent musician, singer, and composer Nena Venezzano released an album titled Pandora's Box. In it, she delivers a wonderful version of Galatea's perhaps most famous lyric poem, Amartolo, Sinner. I provide in my last slide the verses of the song in both Greek and translation, and I would like to close my talk today by listening to Galatea's emotion. After this, I'm more than happy to discuss any questions you would like to address or pose following this brief talk. Thank you.
Στη Σμύρνη Μελπό έως στη Θεσσαλονίκη, στο Βόλο κάτι Νίτσα ένα τώρα στα βούρλα με φωνάζουν Λέλα. Ο τόπος μου ποιος ήταν, ποιοι δικοί μου. Αν ξέρω αναθεμάμαι, σπίτι πατρίδα έχω τα μπορντέλα. Ως κι η πικρή μου χρόνη παιδική μου, θολές σβησμένες ζωγραφιές κι να διανούσε ντούκι θύμησή μου. Το σήμερα χειρότερο απ' το χτες και το αύριο απ' το σήμερα δεν άνε. Φιλιά από στόματα γνωστά βρισιές κι οι χωροφύλακες να με τραβολογάνε. Γλέντια καυγάδες ως να φέξει, αρρώστιες αμφιθέατρο συγκρού και νέσεις 606. Πνιγμένου καραβιού σάπιος ανίδι, όλη η ζωή μου του χαμού, μα από την κόλαση μου σου φωνάζω. Η εικόνα σου είμαι κοινωνία και σου μοιάζω. Μα από την κόλαση μου σου φωνάζω. Η εικόνα σου είμαι κοινωνία και σου μοιάζω.
Thank you.
Costa Mayon. Anna, thank you for that exquisite song and also excellent presentation. I think I might start the questions, the Q&A. A couple of questions for you. I really like that presentation, that slide with the timeline. It's quite a good slide. You didn't have much about the 1920s there, where I think Galatea would have been in the 30s, done a bit of writing, was living in Athens, and it would have been a bit of a turbulent decade for Athens, absorbing the hundreds of thousands of Asian minor refugees and so forth. So did those experiences influence her writing at all, or did she make any commentary in her works about the decade of the 20s and basically the challenges of absorbing those refugees and the impact that they had on city life?
Okay, very rich question, I must admit. The presentation and the duration of the presentation presented to me certain challenges, and this perhaps may answer some of the questions from attendees that I just glanced at some of the questions. It was a matter of choice. I am aware that for Galatea, we could run a series, and we could run a series of several lectures, because Galatea, in fact, could be a course at academia. My focus today, and I had this dilemma, what to do with Galatea, and what to choose from Galatea. Did I really want a very straight up biographical linear account of her life and work, or did I want to highlight and to present an author's engagement with writing itself. And why would we think that Galatea is an important writer? And therefore, the focus of my presentation today was on her modernism output, her modernist output, her writing itself. And that is why I divided it into genres, and I provided highlights of these genres. The fact that that did not include her arrest, her torture by the Taxas dictatorship, I also omitted it for this specific reason, that I did not want my presentation to have a historic angle. I wanted it to show to those who have never read or have never known about this woman that her production, her written production, was important, and it was big, because it was big. And I think that this was my main, let's say, goal. The rest we can read in biographies. The rest has been publicized or written in newspapers, in magazines, in periodicals. You know, it's all there. I just wanted to concentrate information about a woman writing all her life and writing a lot.
That's fair enough. There's only so much you can cover in an hour. And just one other quick question. I was quite impressed by her translations, because there were works where, the original language could have been, Russian if it was Chekhov, or German with Leibniz, or French or English. I presume she was translating from the original as well, so she probably had a working knowledge of quite a few languages.
Yes, indeed, indeed she did. On some occasions, I think that was. I'm not sure about that. Whether I don't remember. I don't recall right now. But I think in Tolstoy, I think she used the French translation and not the original Russian. But I do know that she also had a working knowledge of these languages. And she never actually stopped translating. Again, we are looking at small fragments of her work, whether translation or original, theater, essay, journalistic, and so on.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll go now to the questions from the audience. There's two from Michael Alexandratos. I might ignore the second one, which is on experience during the Metaxas dictatorship, which you touched upon. But Michael asks, what do we know about Galatea's relationship with other left-wing writers of the milieu and their reaction to her work, Vardalis, Voutira, Zarkos, and Picros?
Yes, I think that was already mentioned in passing when Galatea was working with them in the small press of the time period. And it was this particular team, the high intellectuals, as they call, the advanced intellectuals, as they call themselves, of Greece. Okay, it's poor translation, but pretty much that was it. They thought of themselves as an elite, but in a way that was not arrogant or dismissive. In fact, they somehow had a kind of political and social conscience that thought was the core of intellectuality. In other words, Galatea's work has been blamed on more than one occasions as simplistic or shallow or not modernist enough to not be understood, because we can think of the big people, the great people of Greek modernism, and of course Ezra Pound and HD, and I would say Ezra Pound, James Joyce, and so forth, who thought that poetry and generally literature are an elite process. Galatea and these particular group that you have to whom you have referred they thought that literature and education should be made accessible.
Okay. Next question is from one of our teachers, Vicky Lampropoulou. Can you comment on her statement of belief, Galatia's statement of belief, of the phenomenon of egocentrism of the Greek intellectuals?
Yes, that's an excellent question, because I think that also might be one of the reasons why Galatea was buried. In Greece, and I'm not the first one to say so or to admit so, the elite, the so-called elite of intellectuals, were also critics. And therefore, you would see people like Xenopoulos, for instance, or Voutira, for instance. You would see the great authors who somehow controlled or dominated the arts and letters of the mass media of the time, that is, journals and newspapers. And therefore, it would be very difficult if an author, let alone an author who probes and who actually encourages conflict and confrontation, like Galatea, how much and to what extent would such an author be accepted by such an elite? Therefore, it was like a one-way street.
Okay. I've got another question here from Steve Bakalis. In your view, was Galatea a pragmatist besides being associated with the left? Let's say, was she critical of left politics in Greece? And thank you for the informative presentation.
My pleasure. Galatea's, that's a little biographical, but I suppose that we can read between the lines that Galatea was not a people pleaser, and therefore her writing and her opinions, which she openly expressed, sometimes more openly than she should have at the time, created this kind of friction. Galatea decided and that she would not play political games. It is famous, this terrible fight and the terrible, how can I say it, breakup she had with the communist left when her most popular to now play, The Ship Sails, was staged in 1932 at Ethniko Theatro, the National Theatre. Of course, the nature of the play, which once again was taking a group of people in a small microcosm of a ship as the ship sails, and opening up their inner worlds in an enclosed space, made the right-wing critics and the left-wing critics go against her. And that is the time when Galatea, furious for the left-wing critics, she resigned as chief editor of Nei Protopori, because she thought that they were completely unfair. And then she also wrote in defense of her writing. I think that one of the most important moments of Galatea's self-disclosure and self-confession is when she resists the terrible attacks, the terrible negative critiques she's receiving at the time. She keeps writing negative critiques. She keeps on writing. She keeps on. And then she writes at some point that, you have to sit down and you have to read my works carefully. you need to show the respect, and you need to sit down and study. I think this is a very important complaint of women writers, because I've seen this complaint in other women poets as well, of the Anglophone world that I've studied, that they complain that they are not read carefully because they are dismissed from the start. And I think that Galatea was buried because of that.
Okay, thanks for that. I think we're very close to bringing proceedings to a close because we're well past the hour. I might pass on to Spiridula to close the seminar tonight.
Dr. Fyta, thank you for an incredibly stimulating lecture, and I look forward, congratulations, many, many times over. I look forward to reading your writing on the topics that you just didn't have time to elaborate on, things like, the absence of the feminine in Greek writing and, in Galatea's works, or even the path to creativity through education. That you touched upon so many things there. So congratulations many times over for talking to us. And personally, I feel very stimulated from the things you brought up, and I will be looking further into Galatea's writing. I admit that I knew very little about her and until tonight. So thank you very much. I wish you ongoing productivity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and it was a wonderful opportunity to share my findings and to encourage other scholars and other readers to investigate.
Oh,
and perhaps we could translate at long last. I mean, a biography is still waiting.
Well, I also have to add, your research into her work is phenomenal.
Thank you.
So I congratulate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I just
everything was translated, I assure you, because there were no English sources. So every piece of quotation and every stitch that I put together.
It came through, Dr. Fyta. Your work came through. Congratulations. Yeah. I will now like to progress to some housekeeping for next week's lecture. Next week's Greek History and Culture seminar is titled Debunking Xenophon, Sifting Fact from Dross in the Life of a Major Historian. The renowned historian Dr. James MacDonald will be our speaker next week on the 16th of March at 7 p.m. on the mezzanine. So it's a lecture that everyone can attend. It's a free entry. It's at the Greek Centre in Lonsdale Street. Please come and be present. The seminar aims to debunk myths surrounding the life of Xenophon, one of the major historians of ancient Greece. Volumes have been written by Xenophon, the historian who continued the narrative of the Peloponnesian Wars, where Thucydides left off, taking readers through the events of the 4th century BC and concluding with the Battle of Mantinea. So Dr. James MacDonald has an impressive academic background in Greek history, having convened Greek history at the University of Sydney and the Australian National University in the 1990s. He continues to edit Doug Kelly's posthumous commentary on Xenophon's Ellenika, with a second volume to be released in early 2024. The final volume is edited by Oxford academics Christopher Haddad and Ellen Ryan, and that will be released in 2025. And finally, I also want to remind you all that on Sunday at 3 p.m. at the mezzanine, Dimitri Tsamoukas is going to launch his new book. So please come down on the weekend as well. Thank you all for your presence tonight. And once again, thank you to Dr. Fyta for an incredibly stimulating and very informative insight into the life and works of Galatea Kazantzakis. So good evening to you all.